Hey everyone. So in this video, I'm going to cover how to make serious money in commercial property. This is something I cover in my online course, but it's something I really wanted to go through here in this video because the steps are simple. And I've used this framework that I've got here. I've used it countless times to create really enormous upside for me and my clients. So I'm really excited to share this video with you. So the 6 steps that we're going to cover, okay? The first one is that you need to find, source, or locate the property. Naturally, if you're going to make money out of property, well, you've got to find and locate it first. And I teach you how to do that as well. There's a couple of different mechanisms we can use, and different forums we can go to find properties that have imbued value in them that we can then unlock. All right, so really important we start with step 1. Step 2, well, we run our feasibility and we look at exactly what all the assumptions are that we want to play with. And then our feasibility will give us a numerical answer for those assumptions. And that's really important, right? Any investment is only as good as the numbers it's going to produce and the returns it's going to create. We don't want to be getting emotional about our investments. So the feasibility here will tell us the answers in a numerical sense. And the more information we can gather during our due diligence, which is step 3, the more due diligence the more information we can cover during our due diligence, which is actually step 4, I should say, the more information we can put into the feasibility, and then the better answer we will get. All right. So you start with finding or sourcing, locating the property. Step 2 is run your feasibility, and that's higher level stuff, right? We don't go into the granular details just yet at that point. It's just a high level picture of, is there money to be made out of this deal? And if there is, only then do I want you going and spending time in trying to actually secure or contract the property. That's why that is step 3, contracting or securing the property. There's no point going out and trying to contract a property if there's no money to be made out of that property. So feasibility has to come beforehand, but then a feasibility is such that I want it to be a living, breathing thing that you actually work with. It's like, yes, you might have an initial set of numbers that might tell a story, but once you go and contract the property and then actually do your due diligence, you should be refining those numbers and tweaking them and changing that assumption and seeing what that means and changing that input. And they'll all tell you a more detailed answer, which is a tighter numerical bandwidth of which you can use to make money, which is really great. So step 3 is contracting and securing the property. Okay, then step 4, and this is where the rubber really meets the road. We actually want to go and conduct our due diligence and secure our finance. Now, those often go hand in hand, and I like to do it that way because it means that, when you go get a due diligence period on a property, you might get 30 days or 45 days or 60 days. And I like to do them in tandem because the information you gather during your due diligence may impact your finance. Now, in an ideal world, you'd actually do your due diligence first and then do your finance afterwards. But I'm finding in today's market, it's more difficult to secure property with that length of time and needing to have 2 conditional stages before the property is unconditional. Sellers don't usually like that. So I've been moving more towards putting those into the same bucket and doing them at the same time, which is totally doable. And I find it actually is more synergistic. They work better together, actually. Okay, step 5. This is exciting. This is where you manipulate your value. And that might be after you buy the property. It might be during your due diligence period. It might be during your settlement window. I don't know. But you've got to manipulate the value to anything you buy. I strongly recommend that you look at commercial property as a vehicle to generate huge wealth. And in order to do that well, I'm not a passive buyer. I won't just buy something passively and sit back and hope for the best. I'll actually find an asset that I can immediately manipulate its value and then still sit back and enjoy the rest if there's more to come, okay? But I like the idea of getting into an asset and immediately creating an uplift in the value such that there's an immediate return to me, even if things go bad. So let's say the market tanks and there's, I have to sell the asset at a 10% loss. Well, if I've created a 10% uplift, then all of a sudden I'm square. Or what happens if I buy an asset for $20 million and there's $2 million of purchase costs? And if I don't manipulate the value upwards, from day one, I'm essentially sitting there enjoying a rental maybe, but I haven't actually even got my money's worth yet because the value is still below all the costs that it cost me to get in. So I always want to manipulate the value really early on. I try and do that during my due diligence so I can actually de-risk the asset during due diligence, such that by the time I come to purchase it or settle it, it's de-risked from day one. I love that. Show you how to do all that in my online course. And then once you've manipulated your value, you then have a typical period of ownership, or otherwise you're trying to on-sell the asset, which is step 6. You either want to hold the asset or sell the asset. All right, so let's go into some more detail here about these 6 steps. But before we go there, why listen to me? Well, I've got 20 years of commercial property investing experience. I've been doing this for 20 years now. I absolutely love it. I've got an incredible passion for it, which is why I can do these videos and offer them to you for free. And I've transacted well over $500 million during that time. And that's included, well over 100 leasing deals. It's probably closer to 200 leasing deals now. And I say that because a lot of the value that I have been able to manipulate and generate in upside has been through really strategic leasing and creating win-win outcomes for me and the tenant. That's another cornerstone principle of mine. During that time, or during my 20 years of commercial property investing, I have run a syndicate business for about 15 of those years, and I've produced an average syndicated return of over 21% per annum, which is pretty good in a lot of respects. Like if you had to look at any investment avenue, you can invest in shares or invest in bonds or cryptocurrency, or residential property. But if you're getting a 21% return per annum in commercial property by investing in one of my syndicates, you're doubling your money every 5 years. And that's from the returns alone, okay? So it's a pretty healthy return. I'm very, very proud of that. I'm also proud about the fact that I've never lost a dollar for my syndicate members during any one of their returns, okay? So that's something I'm quite proud about. But here's something that's even more important, is that I learned an incredible formula and applied that formula during the 20 years of commercial property investing, but I've refined that formula more recently in the last 5 years. And during those 5 years, I've got countless examples now of offering well over 100% returns per annum for myself and obviously for my private clients. Some of those into the 200, 300% range per year, which is astronomical. But I have a tried and tested formula and I know exactly how it works, and I've covered the 6 steps already. So let's go into a bit more detail about those 6 steps now. If you do like this content, guys, please subscribe and follow me, investorcode.com.au, and you can also find my online course there for anyone who's interested. Okay, finding, sourcing, and locating the property. Well, there's kind of 4 ways you can go about doing this, okay? And the most obvious one in today's world is online listings. Now, the nice thing about online listings is that there's very powerful filtering tools. So you can actually go online, you can go to commercialrealestate.com or realcommercial.com or commercialready.com, and you can actually filter properties by sector or by size or by price or by age. You can filter by whether it's vacant or tenanted. And so there's a really powerful filtering mechanism. And if you know why you're buying a property and you have a direct line of sight as to how you're going to manipulate value, then this can be a really powerful tool to use because it can save time looking at opportunities that won't fit your criteria, okay? The con there is that it can be quite time consuming, like doing a lot of scrolling. But again, very powerful filtering tool. So it's a fantastic source of where to locate or find good opportunities. Then there's billboards, and this should not be overlooked, okay? It might feel a bit 1980s, but it should not be overlooked. The nice thing about billboards is that you get an immediate feel for the property based on its area, its location, how people are interacting with it, how you're interacting with it, its visibility, its exposure, how the eventual client might interact with it, how the tenant might interact with it, the state of the property, the age of the property. You can get an incredible amount of information from just like 5 minutes driving around a property. And even just looking at a property, you can go, oh, that looks pretty old, or this one's so much lower than the rest of them, or wow, that's, that office is really high up in the sky, or how that's got fantastic accessibility, or you know what, I have to make 3 different U-turns to get to the property. There's so much you can actually garner from billboards and from seeing a property in the flesh. And it's an incredibly important step of any due diligence to actually see the property as well. But it is limited in that there's no off-market opportunities by doing that. So you're literally driving around and seeing billboards. The nice thing is that if you do know what areas you want to buy in, so you're very location specific, well, then you can just go drive the areas that you want to acquire in, and those billboards will give you a really good idea of what's available. The con there, as I've said, is that there's no off-market opportunities. So if you're seeing a billboard, everyone else is seeing it too. Okay. Then there's agents. And this is a fantastic source of information if you can get it right and if you can find trusted sources, like trusted agency, okay? They're few and far between. The nice thing is that if you interact with agents well, you can get off-market opportunities. And that could be worth its weight in gold. Really, really important. Fantastic source of opportunities that no one else has seen. You're not fighting with other buyers on the market, which is really great. The con there is that if you don't do that well and you are too flippant and you offer too much information, or you don't have a trusted agent, well, then any information that you offer could leak into the marketplace. So let's say you have a tenant in your back pocket and you want to buy a 3,000 square meter office in the Brisbane CBD. If you tell the agent that, and you tell them that they work in oiling, mining, gas, well, then that agent's going to go and try and find who that tenant is and do a deal, right? So you need to be careful about what information you offer to an agent, and it's really important to build rapport with an agent. And the best way to do that is to interact with them often and frequently. Again, like I've got some trusted agents, and they are amazing sources of opportunities for me and my clients, and so I trust them implicitly. But they're few and far between. So you really want to spend some time building rapport and getting a feel of if you can trust or if you can't trust. And if you can, there's a huge, huge market there in off-market opportunities. Okay. And then the last one's interesting, and a lot of people don't think about this, but tenants. Tenants is maybe the best source of where to find locate properties, because if you have tenant demand, it's far easier to match a property to a tenant than it is to match a tenant to a property. And I say that because if you start building your network and if you start having conversations with people and you tell them that you're interested in commercial property investing, it won't be long before tenants themselves, people that are renting, start saying, you know what, I'm in 250 square meters now and I want to be in 500 square meters, I need to upgrade. Or, you know what, I'm in Subiaco but I want to be in West Perth. Or, you know what, I'm in a regional location and I want to open another 3 stores in Metro. Or, you know what, I'm in a strata building right now and I want to be in a freehold. And all of that is music to my ears because that is essentially tenant demand. Now that is an incredible way of sourcing an opportunity. The con is that you then need to go find the property to match the tenant demand, okay? But it's extremely direct, and having a tenant, particularly if they're of reputable caliber, like a good tenant, good payer of rent, in a decent profession, if they have a demand and you understand that demand, it is so much easier matching that demand with a property. I really encourage you to have conversations around the barbecue and, really expand your network as much as you can into the property market, because tenants can be an incredible source of opportunities if you get it right. And if you can do the right thing by a tenant, they'll come back to you again and again and again and again. Like I've got tenants now that I've done deals with them in Queensland, and now they've come to me saying, look, we want to roll out 3 stores in WA. We only want to use you to do it. So that's an example of creating win-win outcomes with tenants and starting with trying to match the tenant demand with the property and actually saying, hey, like, I know you've got a demand here. I know you've got a reason or a need. Can I help you in that? And that's an incredible way of generating win-win outcomes, which inevitably create huge uplifts in value. Okay, so there's a couple of websites I'm listing here. If you did want to go and do the filtering, look, The Real Commercial is probably the most popular. Commercialrealestate.com is a bit of a catch-all, and then Commercial Ready is a bit more specific and it's becoming more popular. It's gaining traction at the moment, but those are 3 great websites there if you want to go and check those out. Okay, step 2 is you run your feasibility. Now, how do we do this in a way that we want to spend the minimal amount of time with the maximal result, as in we want it to tell us the story as quickly as possible with the most minimum amount of time spent, okay? That's what the feasibility should be. Because you don't want to be spending hours and hours and hours and hours on a feasibility, and then you find out that it doesn't tell you the right answer and you don't want to buy the property. You want to spend 4, 5, 6 minutes on a feasibility and immediately know if that property is worthwhile spending one more second on or not. And that is a good feasibility, in my opinion, to know what to move on to, on to the next deal, on to the next deal, on to the next deal. Oh, wow, this feasibility is showing I can make 500 grand out of this deal if we get it right. Okay, now you start needing more information and you can start making a list of the things you would like to understand during your due diligence. So that is what the feasibility is here, guys. It's a way of taking a huge amount of information, chucking it on a spreadsheet, but giving you a very simple numerical answer to give you a quick yes or a quick no. That's what I want you to use it for in the first instance. Then I want you to keep it live and come back to it again and again and again and again and continue to refine it throughout the remaining steps, right? So we've got 6 steps. This is step 2. And then after step 2, you need to keep that feasibility alive and keep working on it in step 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So a couple of things you're going to need to know whether the feasibility is telling you the right answer. So really, what we're wanting to see here is the buying and selling. Is there a margin in doing that? So is there a margin in buying at 1 million, selling at 2 million, right? Is there a margin to be made? Is there a profit to be made? And on top of that, you want to add any annual return that you might be generating from the property during your ownership period. So if you're buying in January and selling in February, well, that's only 1 month. So there might not be an annual return per se, but there might be $1 million uplift between your buying and your selling price, okay? So if you're holding a property for 10 years, there might be a really huge weighting of your total return might be in the annual annuity that you receive, okay? And your buying might be lower, but your sale might not be that great as long as you're making an incredible annual return. So you got to factor in both of those things, and a good feasibility spreadsheet will do that. It'll allow you to look at the margin, as in the uplift that you've been able to generate, and it'll also show you the annual cash flow that you can generate, okay? And then you should be able to take those two numbers together is your total return. Then you've got your buy costs, and you really want to interrogate those. You've got your sale costs, and you really want to interrogate those, okay? So when you're looking at your margin, you really want to make sure that the buying and selling costs are all inclusive. So I'll come back to that in a minute as we go down the slide. But the other thing you need to make sure you do is include letting up and leasing costs. Now, if you're buying a commercial asset, the assumption here is that you're buying it to enjoy rental income or otherwise put a lease in place and sell it with a lease in place, okay? So if that's the case, you need to factor in all the costs it's going to take you to secure that tenant or keep that tenant. And that might, I'll go into more detail on the next slide, but you're going to have to take into account all of those costs, okay? And I'll show you what some of those might be on the next slide. And remember, a feasibility here is only as good as its assumptions. So again, as I said before, if you want to hold an asset for 5 years or 10 years, then you might have a little bit more wriggle room in your feasibility than if you're only going to hold it for 2 months. If you're only going to hold it for 2 months, you might need to be in and out, and the numbers have to be really, really spot on. But if you're going to hold it for 10 years and you know that you're going to enjoy a rental of 100 grand a year and you only end up generating 99 grand a year, well, that's probably going to be okay over the long term. But that $1,000 difference in annual rental might mean a huge difference if you're trying to sell it in 2 months' time, okay? So the assumptions that underpin the numbers that go into your feasibility will determine, obviously, the answers that your feasibility will give you. So those assumptions have to be really solid and they have to be conservative. You've got to use conservatism when you're doing your feasibility, okay? Because things can go wrong during due diligence, and things can go wrong during an ownership period. And sometimes things can't be foreseen. You've got to go in there with your eyes wide open and build some conservatism in. Okay, some good examples of buy costs. We've got stamp duty, we know that. Now, in some states, like South Australia, for instance, there's no stamp duty right now, so you wouldn't have to factor that in. But in all the other states, there's stamp duty. There's a legal review, which might be the review of the contract or a review of the the mechanism that you're using to buy the property, whether it's a contract or an option or some other form of transfer. You also might want to get the lease reviewed or leases reviewed. You might want to get some searches done, like there might be a list of 100 searches that your legal team can help you with. Then there might be a settlement cost of your settlement agent to actually attend settlement for you. You might want to get some environmental reports to make sure that the land in question is good. You might want to get some town planning advice. You might want to get a technical due diligence report, which talks about the building structure and the building fabric and how old the roof is and the air cons and the lifts and the maintenance and the floor coverings and the wallpapers and whether it's in good nick or not. It'll tell you about your OH&S standards, any of the compliance issues you need to be aware of. So tech due diligence report's an incredibly valuable report if you get that done well. That might be $7 or $8 grand. You might want to get an area survey to make sure that the area that you suppose is available for lease is actually available for lease, or the area that is currently being leased is correct. There's been so many instances where I've bought a property and it says there's 2,000 square meters for lease, and actually there's 2,200. And the current owner has no idea that there's 200 meters of mezzanine that they're not even getting a rental on. So getting an area survey is really important. And then you typically want to have a look at your major expenditure items like your aircon and your lift. Okay, so aircon reports or lift maintenance records, you really want to spend maybe a couple of grand there just understanding exactly what you're buying. Like, are they in good condition? Are they in bad condition? Are they 20 years old? Are they 30 years old? Are they running on old refrigerant? Has the lift been serviced regularly? All those kinds of things you want to factor in to your buy costs, okay? Because they're all gonna add to this, essentially the cost of you acquiring the asset. Then we talk about sales costs, okay? Now, obviously, you're going to have to get an agent to sell the property for you. So there's usually an agency commission. That might be 1%, it might be 2.5%, it might be 3%, who knows? Then there's marketing and advertising costs. So you're going to have to, how are you going to advertise the premises? So you're going to put it online. You might need to get some photography done or some aerials or some drone flyovers, or you might need to get some architectural renders done if it's that kind of property. So that all comes into place in that advertising and marketing bullet point there. You really want to make sure you give yourself ample room and have some cost embedded in what it is going to cost you to sell the asset and to sell it well. Like, you don't want to cut corners when it comes to selling. That's the last few moves that you will ever make on a property, is what to do when you're selling it. So, make those moves really good and get an X factor price. And then on the selling side, you might have the same thing. So legals and settlement and contract preparation, like, you're going to get a lawyer to help you with some of that. You want someone to attend settlement for you. So these are some of the costs that a good feasibility will immediately account for. And I've obviously got a feasibility in my online course, and I give that to you if you buy the pro module. But one other thing here, which is worthwhile mentioning in your sale costs, is that you do need to deduct, typically now, you do need to deduct the outstanding value of any incentives. So if you secured a lease for 10 years and you did so at a 10% incentive and you're selling it with 8 years left on the clock, well, there might be 80% of that incentive might still be sitting with the lease. So you might have to extinguish that upon settlement. It's very typically done in the commercial property game. So I thought I'd mention that as another cost that you really want to make sure you capture in your feasibility. Then there's leasing costs, and there's a huge amount of variables that go into this, but this is where you can manipulate value in an incredible way. Okay, so it's worthwhile taking the time to understand this and getting it right. Agency commissions. So are you going to lease the property yourself, or are you going to get an agent to do it? They might charge you 10, 12, 15, 18, 20, 25% leasing commission, all right? There's marketing and advertising costs. There might be photography, aerials, drones, online listings, anything that you need to take the property and put it on the market for lease, right? Then there might be vacancy downtime. And I make a point of mentioning this because if you're not receiving rent for 3 months, well, you're obviously, that's a cost to you, is that you're still incurring the cost of owning the property. There might be land tax and levies and repairs and maintenance and rates and land taxes and who knows, right, of ownership costs. plus you're not actually getting a rental, plus you might be expensing every month an interest to the bank if you have finance. So the vacancy downtime there is not just what you're not receiving in rental, it's what you're not receiving and the costs that are going out the door. And you would summate all of those for 3, 6, 12, 9 months, who knows, right? Again, the feasibility is only as good as your assumptions. And for particular asset classes, you'll have different assumptions in there. But it's important that you do cover that assumption in your vacancy downtime. Then there might be incentive levels to attract a new tenant. So you might need to offer a 10, 15, 20, 25, sometimes a 50% incentive to attract a new tenant to the building if you have a vacancy. Now, if you don't have a vacancy, you might still need to offer an incentive to maintain the current tenure or extend the current tenure of the tenant in place. Okay, so again, you really want to make sure you cover that off in your feasibility as well. There might be some refurbishment costs that you need. Maybe the premises is 35 years old and it was, suited 35 years ago, but now it's a bit tired and dated. You might need to upgrade the toilet and the bathroom facilities, or maybe it doesn't have a ramp for universally accessible building. You might need a gender neutral toilet, for instance. Maybe you need green credentials. It might need to have solar on the roof or better heating or cooling. All of these things will be dictated by the type of property you're buying and the type of tenant that you want to attract. Now, if you want to attract a government tenant, you need to have a 5-star neighbors rating. You need to have a lot of green credentials ticked. It needs to be universally accessible. It needs to have, doorways of a certain width so anyone can get through in a wheelchair, and all these sorts of things are really important. If it's a retail premises, it may not be as important, or if it's industrial, you might not need to have incredible air conditioning in an industrial facility. Maybe it's just an open warehouse. Maybe it needs to have really good quality hard stand. So again, those refurbishments are things that you might have to spend on the building to bring it to a standard that then will allow you to attract the next tenant or maintain your current tenant, okay? So I want you thinking about that on two fronts: maintaining the incumbent tenant or attracting a new one. There might be fit out periods. So I know that in retail, I do a lot of retail leasing, and I did a 10-year lease the other day to a tenant, and I offered them a 10% incentive in terms of incentive. So number 5 there was an incentive of 10%. I paid a 15% agency, that's number 1. And then number 6, I had to spend $120,000 on the air conditioning in order to bring that up to scratch. That was item 6. And then number 7, they wanted 3 months of occupation in the property without paying rent or outgoings, so that they could actually, put their fit out in and get the property in a way that they need it to be in order to conduct their business. So, they wanted to come in and put the floor coverings down and paint the walls and make sure that the ceiling height was the right level and that the toilets were in the right place, and put out their shop. The shop front was needed to be in a certain area, and they needed to have toilets in a particular place. And so that's a really good example of, they wanted, on top of the incentive, they wanted a 3-month period to get in and actually fit out the premises. Sometimes tenants also want a handover period. It's like, well, they might have a fit out period, but they also might want 2 or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 months potentially in handover, which means that they can get the premises. Maybe there's some items that are pretty vanilla in nature. Maybe the premises is like a cold shell. There's not even floor coverings down, or it's just bare walls, in which case the tenant might say, look, instead of you spending all your money fitting this out for me and then handing it over to me, why don't you just give it to me now as it is and give me a 2-month handover period where I'm going to go do the base build stuff, and then I'll take a 3-month fit out period. So you just need to be really aware that these costs can crop up in your leasing, okay? So I'm putting them down here so you can cover these off in your feasibility. Then you want to be really conservative in your market rental ranges, right? So are you adopting a rental of $300 a square meter or $500 a square meter or $80 a square meter? And is that relevant and relatable to the market? If you've got a retail premises, you shouldn't be assuming that you're going to make $1,000 a square meter if it's a large format. If it's a shopping center and you've got a small little lotto kiosk, well, maybe you will get $1,000 a square meter. So it's just really important to have your eyes wide open and then build some conservatism into those market rental ranges. And guys, a good feasibility should take all of that into account. It should take all of this information into account and tell you an answer. I've got an amazing feasibility that I use in my online course if you'd like to go check it out. Then you might want to understand the length of your lease, okay? The length of the lease can also impact item 5, item 6, item 7, and item 8. All right, so the length of the lease is quite important. It could also impact item 1, depending on how long that lease is, might also impact how much commission you have to pay to an agent. Okay, those are the first 2 steps. Now we're on to step 3, contracting and securing the property. How are you going to go about doing that? And I always suggest using a heads of agreement to get the agreed commercial terms, getting it done really swiftly. There's so much time and energy can be lost when things drag out. So I often try and act really quickly within 2 weeks, sometimes even within a week. I like to get terms agreed, signed, sealed, and on paper. And that's just the commercial terms, okay? There might be price, deposit, due diligence, settlement, any finance that's necessary, and any like high level special conditions like deduction of incentives. You want to get those on paper really quickly. Once you've got agreement there, then only would I spend my time and my money in getting a solicitor to prepare a contract. I definitely would not do step 2 here until I've done step 1. So I always like to do step 1 first. The heads of agreement's another template I've given you in my online course, but it's really just a way of getting both parties on paper really quickly. And then you take that agreement, you give it to both solicitors and you say, look, we've already agreed these commercial terms. You guys just need to put this into a form now that allows us to legally transfer this property. That's it. So naturally your scope when it comes to your solicitors is way, way shorter, way, way smaller. And instead of spending $5,000 on solicitors going back and forth for months and months and months, you've done a lot of the back and forth. So now the solicitors can usually get on the same page within, a couple of weeks. As I say, only once I've got a heads will I then go and negotiate and finalize the contract. And I'll usually do that during the due diligence period. Now, sometimes I'll do an option, but this is for sophisticated buyers only who usually want to on-sell an opportunity, or they don't know exactly what entity they want to use to buy it yet. So if you're not, if you're a first timer, I'd probably leave the option to the side for now, but can be a really fantastic document to use if you're willing to flip a property, as in acquire the rights to it, imbue upside in it or create value in it, and then sell on the rights to acquire it, is really what an option is used for. Okay, and in conducting our due diligence now, so step 4. There's 2 elements of step 4. We conduct our due diligence and we secure our finance. Now, due diligence is, I cover this in another video of mine, but there's 3 main things I want you to cover off in your due diligence. And these are just big, broad buckets, all right? The first one is the property, the premises, and the location. The structural integrity of the building, okay? You need to understand, what are you buying here? What are you inheriting? When you buy this asset, is it good? Is it bad? Has it got asbestos? Has it been there for 20 years or 2 years? Was it recently developed, or is it undermined? Is one of the corners sagging? Is it level? Like all of the things that would make this property available to tenants and available to attract an income, okay? So the structural integrity of the asset, plus all the fixtures and the fittings. Is there any risk with the land underneath the 4 walls now? Okay, that's also important to understand. So are there any environmental concerns, or is there town planning? Is there a road widening that's going to happen? Is the land going to be resumed because the government's going to put a new freeway in? Like, you need to understand these things during your due diligence, okay? There's zoning changes in the area. If you're buying an industrial premises and all of a sudden it's going to be, moved from industrial to residential, well, there might be an uplift in the land value, but you might lose the chance to get a tenant. So you need to understand that. And usually a town planner can help with most of that. The second bucket is the tenanting and the leasing situation. Now, if there's a tenant in place, you want to do a lease review. Please don't do this yourself. Please get a lawyer to do this. Now, I would urge you to read the lease yourself and come up with your own conclusions. And then you still get a lease review done and compare your conclusions with your solicitor's conclusions and say, look, do I agree with everything that's come back here in the lease review? Really important that you take time to go through that lease, because if there is a lease in place, that tells you exactly what you can and cannot do. And sometimes it's extremely well worded and extremely particularly worded, and sometimes it's really broad. And you need to understand which one of those it is, because it could be a risk or an opportunity for you. Then there's the tenant review. So is there a tenant in question? And if there is, you want to understand their performance. Now that could be a really simple thing. Like if that's a KFC or a McDonald's, it might be really easy because they're a fantastic business and they're nationally and internationally well regarded. But if it's Jim's Fish and Chip Shop, you want to know, like, how's Jim trading? Is he 6 months behind? Is he 6 months behind on his rent? How long has he been in business? Has he been bankrupt 4 times and this is his 5th business now? Like, you need to understand these things. Maybe it's an office tenant there that that might have been an occupation for 20 years and the business has changed hands 6 times. Well, who's the new owner? Or did the current landlord agree to that change in ownership? Is the clientele of your tenant good clientele or bad clientele? I mean, is it a brothel, for instance? Is it a bar that's attracting bikies? Like that, this all comes part of your due diligence. Okay, you really want to understand if there is a tenant in place. Essentially, what is the reputability of them, their performance in trade, and how likely are they to pay you rent every month? The last thing the last big bucket I use in my due diligence is really the market. That's local, national, and global, okay? So you want to understand the big movers of supply and demand. So a really good example is like, about 10 years ago, there was a huge surge in the talk about online retail. So a lot of retailers were getting really scared that there wasn't going to be any physical stores anymore, in which case, they were all going to move online. That is a global change in human behavior, which will impact retail tenants. Now, it might impact them by this much, or it might impact them by this much, but it's going to impact retail tenants. For instance, like the whole delivery of goods. So like Deliveroo and Uber Eats and things like this, that has drastically impacted the need for cold storage or refrigerated storage close to city locations. Again, that's a change in human behavior that is impacting property values. So it's really important to look at like the more macro picture here of supply and demand. The other thing I want you thinking about is passing versus market rent. Now, I cover this in my online course again, but passing rent is the rent that you're currently receiving. So you are immediately receiving or entitled to receive. And the market rent is what the premises could rent for on the open market between a willing tenant and a willing landlord. So there may be a difference between those two, and that difference could be a huge opportunity or a huge risk. You need to understand if there's a differential between the passing rent and the market rent. I would go as far as to say that if there is a differential there, that one thing could be the biggest potential upside in the property or the biggest potential risk in the property, okay? So really important to understand passing and market rent. And guys, you can get a lot of this information online. Like you can go to Colliers or Jones Lang LaSalle, or you can go to Cushman & Wakefield or Knight Frank and get their quarterly reports, and they'll print quarterly reports and it'll tell you what the market rents are for office and retail and industrial and childcare and hospitality. That'll tell you all that information. You can also go to a valuer and chat to a valuer. They'll give you all of this stuff. They'll tell you about what kind of tenant performance you can expect, the local, national, global dynamics, what's going on. So there's a number of ways you can get this information. If you really needed it from really reputable sources. I've said this before, and I cover this in a lot more detail in another video, but if you want to cover 90% of your due diligence, you just need to ask yourself 2 questions, okay? 90% of your due diligence could be answered or covered off in these 2 questions. The first one is, if I lose this tenant now, how quickly will I find a replacement, and what protection do I have from this eventuality? Really important question. Now, question 2, if I lose this tenant when their lease expires, how quickly will I find a new tenant, and will the asset be more or less valuable? Now, if you can answer those 2 questions and you can go through answering them in a complete way, okay, you will have covered off on 90% of your due diligence. Now, if the property is currently vacant, then obviously in question 1, you would say, given the property is vacant, how quickly will I find a replacement and what protection do I have from this eventuality? And that would then form, all of those assumptions would then be plugged into your feasibility, which is step 2. The second question there, if it was vacant, it's the same thing, right? So it applies right now. These 2 questions, guys, if you cover this off really well, there's another video I've done on YouTube you can find which talks you through exactly what you'll uncover. And it's an incredible source of conducting a huge amount of your due diligence in a cost-effective way. In fact, you shouldn't have to spend anything to cover off 90% of your due diligence by asking these 2 questions. Then you want to secure your finance, okay? Now, there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can go through banks, you can go through non-banks, and you can go through private lenders. There's a couple of pros and cons of each of these, right? Now, you don't have to secure finance for a property, but I have found it to be an incredibly yield maximizing or return maximizing mechanism, okay? The more you can leverage into an asset, the less equity you require, the higher your potential return. If you can understand, mitigate, and control the risks, okay? So with banks, like if you go to CBA or NAB or you go Westpac or one of the major 4 banks or even one of the second tier banks, you're probably going to get the cheapest rate, as in the cheapest interest rate. But it's also going to be the highest level of compliance, okay? And that means that it can be really slow, like really slow, and typically very conservative. So you might only be able to borrow 50 or 55%, maybe 60% from a bank, whereas in a non-bank, you might be able to borrow 70 or 80% of the purchase price. Because, as I've said here, non-banks are commercially minded. They're usually made up of property professionals that have moved into the banking sector, and they make commercial decisions, and they can really understand a strategy and then sit alongside you to help you bring that strategy to life. So as a result of that, they have very fast approvals and they have generally pretty low compliance, but they're expensive. They are very expensive. I'm talking a doubling, a tripling, sometimes a quadrupling of costs from what a bank would cost you. So in terms of interest rate, let's say a bank would give you 6%, a non-bank might give you 9, it might give you 10, it might give you a 15% interest rate, depending on how much you leverage. But potentially you could leverage 70, 80, 90% of a purchase price, whereas a bank might tap out at 60%. So it's good to know which ones of those are going to help you most, depending on the timeline that you're going to use to invest. Are you going to go in and get out really quickly? Are you going to hold it for the long term? Is it currently vacant? All these things come into play. And again, your feasibility, that document in item 2, it's a live, living document. You should be plugging this information into it almost every day, and it should be telling you a new answer. And you should be able to say, well, with all this information I've got, if I put in a banking environment, as in if I put in terms from a bank, what will the feasibility tell me? And if I put in terms from a non-bank, what will the feasibility tell me? And it should give you an answer. And then you can start using that information to make really informed decisions, okay? Then there's private lenders, and they're pretty unsophisticated usually. And there is some settlement risk involved with private lenders, because naturally, if they're private in nature and they're not governed by the Australian APRA or AFSL provisions or credit licensing provisions, well, they might not actually come up with the money when it comes time to settle. So, it's just worthwhile noting that each of these has pros and cons. Like I've got private lenders now that if I call them up, I've got next door neighbors, and if I call them and say I need $2 million, they'll probably give it to me next week. But am I going to be at risk of settlement if I need to settle next week? What happens if it's 2 weeks away? Or maybe they say over the phone, hey, Cal, I'm good for it. And then I come to call on it 3 days later and they've spent it on a new boat, right? Whereas if you're in a banking or a non-bank territory, there's typically some paperwork to go along. There's some kind of regime to make things robust. There's usually some legal documentation, which forms the basis of that agreement. So it's just worthwhile mentioning that banks and non-banks is where I spend most of my time, depending on how much loan to value ratio I want and how fast I want the approvals. Okay, step 5, how to manipulate value. This is incredible if you get this step right. And there's a couple of very, very simple, easy ways of doing this, okay? I've chatted about this in my online course, but investing is a simple relationship of reward and risk time, okay? So if you can de-risk a property what it means is that it is safer for the next person to buy. And if it's safer for them to buy, they will pay more for it, okay? So ways you can de-risk a property, or you can extend the lease. If the tenant's reputable. If it's a bad tenant, well, you don't want to do that at all. You want to kick them out and put a better tenant in, right? You can improve the tenant quality. Let's say you've got Jim's Fish and Chip Shops and you can kick him out and put in McDonald's. Well, naturally, you've added a huge amount of value to the property because an incoming buyer will pay you more for a McDonald's lease than they would for a fish and chip shop lease, okay? You can increase your net receipts. Now, I've said receipts here, not rent, because there's a couple of different ways you can increase your receipts. You can change the lease structure. So maybe it's a semi-gross lease and you can change it to a net lease. Or maybe it's a gross lease and you can change it to a net lease. Or maybe the tenant's paying rental and you can institute a turnover rental threshold, right? A number of different ways you can increase the net receipts. Maybe you can put solar on the roof. Is it creating a new income stream? Or maybe you can put an electrified billboard on the side of the property if there's a lot of cars passing the property, if it's got great exposure. So I just want you thinking about ways more broadly of how you can increase the net receivable from a property. It doesn't just have to be rent. It could be solar income. You could rent the roof space to a solar provider. As I said, you could put electric billboard there. Maybe you put some hard stand down for a tenant if they're industrial. Maybe you say to a tenant, look, I'll put some mezzanine in for you if you give me an extra 10 grand a year. Like, these are all ways that you can increase the income that a property is receiving, which means that it's more valuable to the next person. You might be able to agree a change in the actual market rent. So maybe the tenant's paying $300 a square meter and you say to them, look, I think you should be paying $400 a square meter. Let's change your rental. I'll give you an incentive. Let's change your rent to $400 a square meter. And all of a sudden, you've imbued a huge amount of value into that asset, which then, you know, when you're coming time to sell the property, obviously you would hope to recoup all that value you've created. The other thing you can do here is sharpen the cap rate. And this is a more passive way to do it, is just sit back and kind of wait for the market to improve. Now, if you take a long enough view on things, the market is always going to go up, okay? So if you take a 50-year view on property, statistically, it'll go up. But if you take a 10-year view on property, you know, you might have periods there where the prices actually come backwards a little bit. If you take a 2-year view, maybe that little shorter time frame allows you less risk of the market moving, right? So as I said at the start, you know, value or investing is actually a function of risk, reward, and time. You want to understand what time horizon have you got to actually, you know, create value in a property or enjoy rental income from a property, or what's your ownership period going to be like, because they will all play into how you're able to manipulate value. I cover this in incredible detail in my online course, guys. And if you want to go find that, please head to investorcode.com.au or subscribe to get more of these videos. Okay, step 6, hold or sell. Before you make this decision, I want to make a few things really clear. A lot of people come to me and they ask me the question, Cal, should I sell now? I've created some uplift. Or, Cal, I don't know, I feel like I need to hold this property for another 5 years in order to maximize its value. And I always say, start with this. What is the purpose of your investment? Why did you buy this in the first place? Did you buy it for a rental income? Did you buy it for an annuity? Did you buy it for passive income? Did you buy it to replace your job? Did you buy it to flip it? As in get in at $5, sell it at $10. Like, what was your purpose of getting into this investment? It's really important you understand that, because an investment should aid and abet your lifestyle. It shouldn't do the opposite, okay? Lifestyle factors are important here. Is this a generational asset which you want to hand over to your kids one day? If that's the case, well, obviously you're going to hold it. Maybe you want to hold it in a different structure, right? Maybe you want to buy it in a different structure when it comes to buying. So there's lifestyle factors that come into play here. Maybe you want to enjoy a passive income stream, but there's only 2 years left on the lease. Okay, well, what's the opportunity cost of your money tied up in this asset? Which is what I've covered off in the third point here. So, you know, maybe the asset's giving you a really great return, but it was giving you a great return at 10%, then it was 8%, then it was 6%. Now it's giving you a 4% return. But what happens if you can put your money in the bank and get a 10% return? So you need to look at the opportunity cost of the capital that you have sitting in your investment. How much capital is there and what return is it generating you? And what's the risk that you are taking to generate that return? Like, are you leveraged at 90% to make a 10% return per year? Is that workable? Or can you bring your loan to value ratio down to 50% and maybe you take home a 7% return instead? But maybe that's more palatable if you want to hold it long term. So before you decide whether to hold or to sell, just make sure that you look at the reasons behind those decisions. And ultimately, you want to be making decisions that align with your lifestyle, that align with the purpose of this investment, okay? So there's an opportunity cost of the money. There's also lifestyle factors that are really important, okay? So don't get the skewed, as in don't start making investment-only decisions when there's actually a lifestyle factor sitting behind that investment decision, which is driving the show. If you are going to hold, well, there's things you might want to look at. Is there more value to be added? Okay, so can you unlock more value by holding it? Really great question. And then maybe then you want to ask the question of what is the timeline to add that value? So maybe you can add more value, but it's going to take you another 15 years to do it. Well, do you want to hold it for another 15 years? Or maybe you can hold it for another 2 years, and you know that in 2 years' time, the market rental is going to be even higher than it is today, and all of a sudden there's even more value on the table. Then you have to take into account things like, okay, there might be more value to sell it in 2 years' time. What's my holding costs what are my holding costs gonna do over those 2 years to erode that potential uplift? All right. And if you're going to look to sell a property, well, you might want to look at things like, is the value maximized now? Or can I do things to maximize value before I sell it? Right? Consider the transaction costs to that as well. Like, obviously, to sell a property, there's agency commissions, there's legal costs, there's settlement costs, there might be some incentives that have to be deducted. And then on top of that, you might have a huge amount of tax to pay. Well, that might be an opportunity cost for you. So instead of, getting the full $1 million back from a property investment, you might only get 750 grand back because you got to pay tax. So what does that mean for you when it comes to deploy that capital into the next deal? All right. Is there an impending risk that you don't know about? Or is there an impending risk on the local or global or national scale that can threaten the property value? Is your income at risk, right? So all these things need to be thought about when you're coming to look at the final step of holding or selling a property. And a lot of people suggest that property is a passive investment, but I suggest that it can be a passive investment. But I like to take a really active approach and review a strategy on a property every 6 months as a minimum, sometimes even quarterly, because I might want to hold a property today, but in 3 months' time, Trump might come out and do XYZ to interest rates, and all of a sudden now it makes more sense to sell because I can get 10% risk-free in a bank. So all I'm suggesting to you is that there's an opportunity cost to money, okay? And that you need to understand the purposes of why you bought an asset, which might indicate some of your reasons for selling an asset. And it's worthwhile looking at those beyond just the investments, okay? But the investment returns, if you're going to try and maximize those when you're going to hold it or sell it, there's some key things you want to look at here. Okay, so a really quick summary of what I covered, guys. I went through 6 simple steps. Find, source, locate the property, and I've shown you the sources that you can use to do that. Then you run your feasibility. Remember, this is step 2. High-level feasibility, which is going to give you a yes or a no within 5 minutes. This is not a painstaking exercise. If there's any worries, it's a no, okay? It's got to be an absolute yes for you to spend more time on it. Otherwise, you say, thanks so much. Yep, on to the next opportunity. That's what the feasibility is for. Once you've done that and the property is a yes, as in there's value to be added, or there's a great return on the table, or there's a upside that you can enjoy, or a profit you can enjoy, then I want you going and spending time trying to contract and secure the property. Now with that, I offered a way of thinking about doing that with a heads of agreement first, and then only spending money on your solicitors and lawyers to go draft a transfer document, okay? Once you have contracted the property or you secured the right to buy the property, then you can do your due diligence and you secure your finance. And I like to do those two together in the same steps. And remember, that's a great time to pull that feasibility back out and keep testing the assumptions that you had at step 2. Are they still true? If you're getting more information and it's getting more risky and there's more concern, well, maybe you say, look, thanks so much, I'm walking away. Or maybe you're doing your due diligence and you're getting more comfortable and more excited, and the information coming back is making the outcome look even better than you thought. Well, then you start refining that feasibility. It's a live document that I want you using almost daily when you're doing your feasibility, or when you're doing your due diligence and your finance, okay? When you're coming to manipulate value, that feasibility becomes really important, all right? Now, I've shown you the 3 ways that I like to manipulate value. You want to de-risk a property, and you want to increase the rental receipts, or you want to wait for the market to do its job, okay? And one of those 3, they're all fine in their own right, but when you're coming to that step, manipulating value, the feasibility here should tell you a numerical answer to the questions that you have. That's what the feasibility is. It tells you a numerical answer for all of the inputs that you can get into that model, okay? And Excel is a beautiful kind of program that helps me with my feasibility, and I'll give you that in my online course if you buy the Pro module. Only then, after we've done all those 5 steps, do we decide to then sell or hold a property. And again, the lifestyle factors and actually the reasons why you bought a property in the first instance might impact that more than anything else. All right. So I cover this in my online course, guys. There is a formula here. It's repeatable. I've got a framework that I have distilled and refined to perfection now, that I've used to generate astronomical returns in any property that I buy. And I've been able to de-risk them from day one. And I focus on 3 key actions to drive enormous value using those exact 6 simple steps I just showed you there. I tell you where to find the opportunities and the properties which allow this, and then you learn the essential things that you need to do, and then do them to secure the properties and de-risk them before you buy them. I cover all of that in my online course. If you're interested, please go to investorcode.com.au to find out more. And guys, thanks so much for watching. If you do like the content, please subscribe and follow. I'll see you in next week's video. Thanks so much.